past over over a decade, really about 12 years, I've been researching the connections between the myths and the stars. And I have a little presentation to show, because when I try and explain what I'm talking about, it's hard for people to even put it into a drawer in their head, because we haven't really been taught the constellations. And you'll see what I mean as I'm talking about it. But I wasn't even looking for this. I wasn't looking for this conclusion, but I've always loved the myths. I've always loved the Odyssey and the myths and the stars since I was very young. I mean that all the characters, all the gods, all the heroes, all the princesses, all the monsters, virtually all of them in all the different ancient myths of the world, whether it's ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer, ancient India, ancient China and Japan, the myths, the Norse myths, the myths of Africa, Australia, Greek myths, the Americas, are all using a common system and can be shown to be using a common system. So, okay, there is ancient Egypt. So, what do you think of when you see the Sphinx? And that's one of the pyramids. That's the Menkaure pyramid, not the Great Pyramid, but the weathering on the Sphinx. We think of these researchers who have, in the past decades, been exploring and researching the evidence, which is around the world, archaeological evidence, which argues that there is something, some forgotten civilization or forgotten culture predating even what the conventional timeline tells us. And these are some quotations from, you may recognize, from the late great John Anthony West, who I had the great privilege of meeting and talking with. The origins of ancient Egyptian civilization are a mystery. He said, a realistic approach to the mystery suggests alternatives that are unacceptable to the orthodox mind. He's talking about the conventional paradigm of human history. Just doesn't, the evidence blows apart the orthodox timeline. And then a few lines later, he says, Egypt did not develop her civilization, but inherited it. That's from Serpent in the Sky, pages 196 and 197. And this archaeological evidence is very powerful. I know a lot of you are very familiar with that, have researched it yourself. I would argue that the celestial evidence, or the mythological evidence, is as powerful, or maybe even more powerful, pointing to the truth of what John Anthony West is arguing right there, that there is something else going on in the human timeline than what we're being told in the conventional history. And conventional history will not accept this. Unacceptable to the orthodox mind. I've been writing about this now for 12 years. I've tried to send it off to academics who are experts in the myths, and they're like, that's interesting. They can't. It may be interesting that the Norse myths are tied to the stars, but they will not say, and it's using the same system that's found in the Americas. That's too much for them to accept. So let me drive on. It wasn't until I encountered Hamlet's Mill, like I was mentioning, after I got out of the Army, I already was very into the myths. I was also very into the Bible. I was very into the stars. And I encountered Hamlet's Mill as a result of reading Graham Hancock and other authors who have been influenced by Hamlet's Mill. It was published in 1969. And they argue for the existence of some kind of archaic system, very ancient. They say it's so ancient that, in fact, the dust of centuries had settled upon the remains, this beautiful language that they have in their introduction. The dust of centuries had settled upon the remains of this great worldwide archaic construction when the Greeks came on the scene. It was already just, so ancient it was gathering dust by the time the ancient Greeks got there. Yet something of it survived in traditional rites, in myths and fairy tales, no longer understood. No longer understood. They've been forgotten. They're still there. The system's still operating, but no one even remembers what it was. It's like a mechanism that was built by some ancient, even more ancient, so much more ancient than ancient Egypt, that is more ancient to them than they are to us. This mechanism that was built is still operating in the background, but nobody even really understands it anymore. But the pieces are now just fragments, tantalizing fragments, they call them, of a lost whole, some kind of ancient system. It incorporates, in their argument, it incorporates not just myth and ritual, but also systems of measurement, number. Of course, Randall talks about sacred geometry. That's all part of this ancient system. Time and measurement, like the cubit and all those sorts of measurements, measurements of volume, appear to be based on some coherent ancient whole that relates to the stars and the cycles. But what we have left are basically tantalizing fragments of a lost whole. That's on pages 4 and 5 of Hamlet's Mill, but I'm going to continue the quotation because they use this beautiful metaphor that I love very much. It's a very evocative metaphor, and they say, they make one think, these tantalizing fragments, make one think of those mist landscapes. I've put a mist landscape. This is an actual painting from China from the 16th century, so the 1500s. It's a mist landscape, of which Chinese painters are masters. They say this in Hamlet's Mill. This is on page 4 and 5. Those fragments are like a mist landscape, which show here a rock, here a gable, there the tip of a tree, and leave the rest to your imagination. So look at this painting. There's like a lot of basically blank space because it's kind of covered with mist, or at least you imagine that it's covered with mist. But what I take this metaphor to mean is all these fragments, they're actually connected, but we've lost the connection. It's like a mist landscape. All we get are the pieces, but actually it is part of a coherent whole. And I'll show you, the Bible is part of this whole. The stories in the Bible are also part of this. They are connected to the myths of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient Africa, ancient India. But somehow over the centuries, the mist has rolled in, and now we think they're all separate. And oh, there's a little tree off on the left, a little branch just kind of sticking out, and we think it's separate. They're actually all connected. So what on earth am I talking about? Dave, you're making these grand claims. The easiest way for me to show it, I can show it with text. I can show it with verses from the Bible, verses from the ancient Greek texts like the Odyssey, the Iliad. But really for a visual presentation, which I'm trying to visual is, a picture worth 1,000 words, but this really shows it. The artwork shows that it's based on the stars. This is an ancient, piece of ancient pottery, and on the left, as we face it, we see a figure there, and the ancient artist, or at least the ancient artist's friend who could write, if it wasn't the ancient artist, has helpfully labeled it for us. You can see right there, who is that on the left? It says it, Zeus. That the letter that looks like an I is a Z. That's Zeus from left to right. Now it's been flaked off. The paint has flaked off, and so I'm going to fill it in. I'm just filling it in for you. But he's in a distinctive posture. He's got one hand raised over his head, holding, that's a thunderbolt. The posture, though, is what I want you to look at. He's in a deep lunge. Anyone do lunges every morning, carrying, a kettlebell or something on your shoulder? It looks like he's exercising. He's got his knee almost to the ground. He's got one hand up behind his head with the mighty thunderbolt. He's got one arm reaching out. He's actually battling in this. Anyone know who he's battling? Typhon. That's Typhon. Typhon was so powerful that even though Zeus would hurl thunderbolts at Typhon, he could not destroy Typhon. He eventually had to bury Typhon underneath Mount Etna. Mount Etna, Zeus finally had to just put a mountain on top of Typhon because Typhon was too strong for the thunderbolts even. And so that's why Mount Etna still erupts to this day, because Typhon is still down there every now and then belching out lava. So why am I showing you this? Because in the night sky, here's you can find this on Wikipedia. This is not my drawing. So this shows that the the posture that I'm describing and the outline that I added in is not just me trying to fudge or fake it. This is somebody else. This is in a museum in Berlin. You can go see it. But, a professional artist has drawn what it used to look like, Zeus fighting Typhon. But this is the constellations in the night sky that Zeus and Typhon correspond to. Or I should say, to which Zeus and Typhon correspond. The constellation Hercules and the constellation Ophiuchus. Now, you may be forgiven for saying, I've never seen those constellations before in my life, because we're not taught the constellations, and if we are, we're given a very shoddy way of outlining the constellations. If you look up Hercules on Wikipedia, you will get a terrible outline of the constellation Hercules. But in 1952, a great author, I won't go too much into it, but I've talked about it on other videos, a great author by the name of H.A. Rey published a book in 1952 called The Stars, A New Way to See Them. And I've always argued that, and I grew up with that book, by the way. That's how I grew up looking for the stars, with the books of H.A. Rey. But I now realize that he should have called it The Stars, A Very Ancient Way to See Them, because his outlining system clearly corresponds to the ancient outlining system. Anyone know who H.A. Rey is, what else he wrote? He's a famous author. And his wife, Margaret, are responsible for... Margaret Rey and H.A. Rey created the Curious George stories. After escaping from Paris in World War II, they went to Greenwich Village eventually, landed in Greenwich Village and published the Curious George books starting in the 1940s. And then H.A. Rey wrote this book, The Stars, A New Way to See Them, and illustrated it. And he was lamenting the terrible outlining system that we get stuck with. He said, the way that the constellations are shown is almost like they're trying to confuse you. Well, maybe they are, because they don't want you to know this system. But he said, I'm going to give you a better system. And he outlined them, and that's the system I grew up with. Well, it's very, very amazing. Either he was privy to some knowledge that he decided, perhaps because of the disaster that was World War II, he decided he had to put it in writing. I don't know why he decided to release it to the world in 1952. I don't know if he was inspired by, the spirit realm, or if he was a recipient of this ancient system. But his system is the same system that is in artwork around the world. We could go out, that's a tangent we could go off into, but look at the outline of Hercules at the top left of your screen. Can everyone see that? The outline of Zeus has this deep knee bend with a heel raised. The outline of Hercules has this deep knee bend with a heel raised. His forward knee is, bent. His forward arm is reaching forward, and then he's got a weapon that he's holding over his head. He's also got a square-shaped head. This is very distinctive in the night sky, the square-shaped head of Hercules. Now, I'll tell you, it is not easy to just go out and find the constellation Hercules. It is not easy to find, and yet we find this around the world. So it's an ancient worldwide system. We'll see some more evidence of that. But can everyone see the parallels between Hercules and Zeus? The constellation Hercules. There's a hero named Hercules, who happens to be the son of Zeus. The square-shaped head is important too, because figures who correspond to Hercules in the myth usually have a big full beard. Zeus is usually depicted with a big, because their head is square. Hercules has a big square beard. Thor, the thunder god of the Norse myths, instead of being a thunderbolt, he's got a hammer, the Mjolnir. You can draw the Mjolnir with those same stars. Okay, he's got a big full beard. It's not always male figures. Sometimes it's female figures. The Gorgons, like Medusa and her sisters, are usually depicted in the same exact posture. And instead of having a beard, they've got like a fringe of serpents. But it almost looks like a beard if you look at the ancient pottery depicting Gorgons. I don't show it here, but I'm just kind of going off on tangents, which I sometimes do. Now, Typhon is actually associated with the other constellation on here. It may be a little harder to figure out that Typhon is associated with Ophiuchus, but look at Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus, the name comes from the Greek word for a serpent. Ophiuchus means the serpent holder. And you can see it's kind of got this kind of tombstone-shaped central body in the upper left, if you look up there on the star chart. And then it's got a serpent on either side, two serpent halves. Now the legs down below are kind of faint. So if you just take your finger and put it over the legs down below, you'll see why Typhon, see in the artwork, his body, he's got a torso and then he's got two serpents coming out of his torso. Now look at the two serpents coming out of the central body. That's the two legs of Typhon. And if you've ever gone and gotten a coffee that costs you, $4 or more, you've seen another symbol that comes from the same constellation, right? The Starbucks symbol is a mermaid with two tails coming up. And I can show you artwork that demonstrates that that comes from the same constellation. Anyway, Zeus eventually puts a mountain over Typhon because Ophiuchus sometimes plays the role of a mountain too. You can see why it might play the role of a mountain. Like, look, it looks like a mountain. But there are myths in India, for instance, where the central mountain of the world is being churned by a tug of war where they're pulling on a serpent. You may be familiar with that. You can see it at Angkor Wat. Graham Hancock talks about it a lot in some of his books. The serpent tug of war. They call it churning the ocean of milk. That central pillar, the central mountain of Vishnu, Vishnu is holding on his back, is being churned by the serpent. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but can you see the parallels here? Now I'm going to show you this a little bit more around the world. Here's a Maya codex. So the Maya, of course, lived in what today we call Guatemala, southern Mexico, Central America, basically. A great ancient civilization. It goes back to like 1400 BC at least. This codex, this is called the Dresden Codex. It's one of the four, there's only four that survived, because when the Europeans came over, mainly the Spanish, with the basically literalist Catholic belief, they said these guys are practicing a bunch of things that we don't believe in, and they made a huge bonfire, or many bonfires, and burned all the codexes. It was a terrible loss to humanity. There's only four Maya codexes that survived. This one's called the Dresden Codex because it was basically rediscovered in Dresden in Germany, but because it was sent over to Spain during that 1500s. But look at that figure in the center. It's a Maya thunderbolt god. He's holding a thunderbolt. It almost looks like the thunderbolt of Zeus. He is holding it in a different position. He's holding it with his forward hand, but he's got the exact same deep knee bend. He does not have a big square beard, but he's got a square hat. It's the same pattern in the Maya. Unfortunately, we don't have too many codexes to look at, but there's a clear parallel in the Americas of the exact same convention. He's associated with the same constellation in the heavens. In fact, if you look very closely, you'll see he's got an eagle on his shoulder. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look closely at the Maya god, right underneath where his ear would be, there's an eagle. And Zeus, of course, is associated with an eagle. And Vishnu is associated with an eagle. And why is that? Because there's a constellation called the Eagle, Aquila, right next to Hercules. I didn't draw it in on this map, but it's on the star map, but it's basically right to the left of his foot on your upper left side of the screen. So I would argue this is clear indication of this system working in the Americas. Did the Greeks go over and tell the Maya? I don't think so. The most likely explanation is it comes from something even more ancient, and there was some catastrophe, and then the different people around the world basically held on to their different memories of it, and it evolved into different shapes and forms in different parts of the world. But for sure, they are all, and I've read the Popol Vuh, and I talk about it in one of my books, how not just the pictures, but the text itself, the events in the Popol Vuh of the hero twins going down into the underworld of Xibalba, and doing all these things are based on the stars. So here's one more from the Americas. This is also a Maya. This is a drinking cup from the 7th or 8th centuries. I just did a video about it. It's from the 7th or 8th century. That means the 600s or 700s. Look at it. This is a rain god named Chalk. You can see it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The rain god has one arm reaching forward, one arm behind him with a weapon. In this case, it's an axe. He's got the same heel raised on the rear foot, and other foot is forward, and he's even grasping a circular object. Now let me just bring in the stars slowly. I'm going to just slowly bring in the constellation. You can see how well that posture matches with Hercules. That's Hercules. And in fact, in front of Hercules, in front of the constellation Hercules, there's a brilliant little arc of stars known as Corona Borealis, or the Northern Crown. That word means crown of the north, the Northern Crown. And Hercules figures in different myths reach out and grab something that's arc-shaped. And in this ancient Maya cup, or at least 7th or 8th century AD, the artist has depicted the god, who's a rain god, who has an axe, reaching out and grasping a semicircular or a circular object. It is very clear to me that this is based on the stars. Hopefully that's clear to everybody else. I'll bring it in just one more time. The match is just, pretty much unmistakable, if you ask me. So it's operating in ancient Greece. It's operating in ancient Egypt. It's operating in ancient Africa. There's a god in Africa who has an axe as well. His name's Shango, and he's a thunder god. He's got a thunder axe, just like Thor has a thunder hammer. And they're all based on, they have the same characteristics. Mythical figures associated with Hercules are usually fairly jovial, like Jove, Jupiter, Zeus, but also quick to wrath. They're associated with rain. They're associated with thunder. They usually like a good party. They like to eat a lot, but if you get them mad, they will, throw their hammer or their thunderbolt at you. Here's another figure who fits that same pattern. The son of Zeus, in this case, is Heracles or Hercules. He's always wearing not only a full beard, but lion skin, which makes his head look nice and square, just like the constellation. There's the constellation. He's got his weapon over his head, in this case a sword. He's fighting the Amazon women, in this case, is one of his 12 labors. You can see he's actually reaching out with his one hand, just like Hercules is reaching out. And in some ancient artwork, he's even grasping an arc-shaped crest. You see how the Amazon, that he's putting his hand like on her shoulder, but sometimes he's actually grabbing the crest, which is like I told you about Corona Borealis, the arc shape. Figures associated with Ophiuchus, a lot of times they have a spear because of the outline of the constellation. A lot of times they have a shield. She has a shield. Looks like he's about to chop her head off. I'm not sure what's happening to her, if he's going to be merciful or kill her, I'm not sure. But here's another one where Hercules or Heracles, this is a different episode, not as well known, but the subject of a lot of ancient Greek painting and artwork, where Heracles tried to abscond with or steal the tripod of the temple at Delphi. And Apollo ran after him and said, "Hey, you can't take the temple at Delphi's tripod. What are you doing? Why? Where did that myth come from?" Well, Ophiuchus actually looks kind of like a tripod, or could look like a tripod. I think he's running off with the tripod. Apollo is more associated with Sagittarius. We'll look at Sagittarius in a minute. Sagittarius is down to the left, lower left corner of the screen. So Ophiuchus is basically in between Sagittarius and Hercules, and that's why Hercules and Apollo are having tug of war over the tripod, because the tripod's in between Hercules and Sagittarius, and Apollo is associated with Sagittarius, as I'll show you later, and Hercules is associated with Hercules or Heracles. Here's ancient India. This is a figure in ancient India. He's one of the 5 hero brothers in the Mahabharata. One of the 5 brothers is a Hercules type of a character. He even strangles serpents when he's a baby, just like Hercules. He uses a huge mace instead of a club, but often he'll just rip up a tree and swing that around and beat down his enemies. He fights a bunch of ogres and rakshasas and other demons and things. But look at how he's depicted. His name is Bhima, Bhima. They usually don't pronounce the A. It's spelled like Bhima, but they just say Beam. This is a sculpture of Bhima. Look at the exact same posture of Hercules, because he's a Hercules character. Now, he's got his club in one hand, but what's he got in his other hand? Anyone see that? He's plucked a lotus. Yeah. Look down right below Hercules. You can see the head. You see the head of the serpent that Ophiuchus is holding? Ophiuchus has 2 serpent halves. The right half there is the head, and the left half, as we face it, is the tail. The head of the serpent sometimes plays a bunch of different things in different myths. Sometimes it plays a lotus. And so he's picking the lotus. He's plucking the lotus. Can you see how he's plucking the lotus in the star charts? And here we have Indra. Indra is, which one would be Indra? The biggest figure in the center of the screen is not Indra, that's Vishnu. This is this celestial tug of war with the serpent and Indra in the middle. Sorry, not Indra in the middle, Vishnu. That's Vishnu in the middle is the largest figure. Vishnu, who's associated with Ophiuchus and the mountain and the tug of war. And up above Ophiuchus, who's above Ophiuchus in the sky? That would be Indra. Look at the feet. Look at the way they've put the posture of Indra. Because above Ophiuchus is Hercules. Vishnu is associated with Ophiuchus. In fact, Vishnu sometimes has, if anyone's familiar with the Vedas, a lotus growing out of his navel. You see how Ophiuchus has a lotus growing out of his navel? I mean, there's so much evidence in the myths, it's just not even, in my mind, a question that the ancient myths are based on an ancient worldwide system. Vishnu has a lotus growing out of his navel because Vishnu is associated with Ophiuchus. There's Vishnu in the center. Up above Ophiuchus is the constellation Hercules, and the god Indra is associated with Hercules, and the artist in this wall relief has depicted Indra in the outline of Hercules. Now, in this case, Indra is raining down rain onto Vishnu. You can see the rain there. Indra is a rain god, just like chalk that we saw from the Maya was a rain god, just like Zeus is a thunder and wind and lightning and rain god. Indra also has the thunderbolt. He's not depicted with the thunderbolt here, but he has the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt is the Vajra in India. Now, another interesting thing is that little kind of his waist. He's got like a towel, his garment is around his waist. See how the garment kind of kicks out to the back? That's a common feature. Hercules is usually wearing a lion skin that has a lion tail at the back of it. The Maya cup had the exact same type of garment that Indra is shown with here. That's because I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but you see the bright star right above Hercules. That's the star Vega. The tuft of the lion's tail corresponds to the star Vega. You see, there's a very bright star right above the word Hercules. It's a big black dot on your screen. That's what's going on with their garment. The garment of a Hercules character. I don't know if I can go back. Look, you see how Bhima has that same garment? Look, the tassel around his waist, and then he's got this like almost like a fin-shaped thing sticking out to the left. Look at Hercules. He's always got a tail sticking out. Tail. Look at Chalk, the god. You see that tassel kind of off of his waist? He's got these kind of knotted cords around his waist, but then he's got going down towards the axe. It looks almost just like the Hercules tail, right? It's because of this, because of Lyra. Look, you can see it right here. It's not an exact match on this piece of artwork, but it is an exact match on other pieces of artwork. the Star of Vega is what, sometimes it's even a scabbard of a sword, and they put like a ball right where Vega is on a different piece of artwork that I didn't include in this. Hopefully I'm making the point clear using this ancient artwork. I could do it with myth as well. I could talk about, how Loki steals the necklace of Thor's wife, the beautiful necklace, and then Thor gets all mad at Loki. It's all these stories are based on the stars, but it's easiest to show it with artwork. There's also these dancing celestial beings that happen to be in the same exact posture. I didn't put it in this picture, but if you go to Tiwanaku in Bolivia, the beautiful gate of the sun, that massive, they call it the Puerta del Sol in Bolivia at Tiwanaku, has, that central figure is an Ophiuchus figure, but then it's got all these dancing figures around it that are in the shape of that same exact posture. I could show it. Here's, okay, so here's me, obviously, in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. As you can tell, I'm much younger in this picture. That was like 2017 or something. But look at that beautiful ancient Greek water crater. It's called I think it's called a hydria or a crater. They have different names, specific names for the different vessels. But this is a painting by an ancient artist. Just take in that beautiful ancient artwork. Look at the skill of this painter. We don't know who the painter is. They give the name of the Pan painter to this artist. Nobody knows who the artist was, so the scholars since the 1800s have called this artist the Pan painter, based on the picture that's on the other side of the same vessel. But this is actually the more beautiful side of the vessel. This is a picture of a mythological scene. Anyone know? If you've watched some of my videos, you probably know what it is. But anyone know what myth this is from? Right answer, it is the unfortunate prince named Actaeon, who was out hunting with his friends, got some deer, and it was a hot summer day in the forest, and he said, okay, you guys, I'm the prince, so you guys clean the deer. I'll just go for a walk in the forest. Unfortunately, that was a bad day for Actaeon, because as he walked through the forest, he stumbled into an enchanted grotto there with a little stream and a bubbling brook and a pool, a beautiful scene. But who was bathing in the pool but the goddess Artemis, the divine? She's a hunter as well. She has a bow. She's the twin sister of Apollo, correct, who we just saw and whom I just said is associated with the constellation Sagittarius. He also carries a bow, but this is his twin sister Artemis. She's a very severe goddess. She does not like people crossing the lines. She's pretty strict about protecting boundaries, and especially protecting women and the rights of women. She's present at the birth of all human children in the Greek myths. They pray to her, at the hour of labor. Please, Artemis, let the labor be over and let her deliver a baby. And she's the one who, gives her approval to allow the baby to be born in the ancient Greek myths. And there's reasons for that I would argue are also based on this esoteric system that we're talking about. But she, not to get too off track with the story, Actaeon is just transfixed by her beauty because she's bathing in the pool. Of course, she's naked in the pool. She's attended by her nymphs, and he just stands there basically with his mouth open. He can't do or say anything. And she says, are you getting a good look? Because you're not really supposed to be staring at the goddess while she's bathing. And why don't you go tell your friends, if you can, what you saw? And then she splashes water in his face. And Ovid, the ancient Roman poet, talks about in just kind of almost horrifying terms. He gets splashed water in his face, and suddenly he starts to feel filled with fear. And he tries to say something, but he can't, because he's starting to turn into a deer. And horns start sprouting out of his head. And he finds he's running and he's in panic and he's running faster than he could ever run before, and he's leaping over branches because he's turned into a deer. And then his hounds, of course, catch the scent of the deer, and they're trained to run a deer down. So they start barking, and Ovid explains all this in kind of horrifying language. Actaeon gets very scared by the dogs and starts to try and call to them, but all that comes out of his mouth is kind of a deer bleat, and the hounds start tearing him to pieces, which you can see happening in this ancient vase. The artist actually depicts Actaeon in pretty much human outline, but when I first saw this artwork, I said, oh my goodness, look at that. That is clearly celestial. The ancient artist, whether the ancient artist was doing it deliberately or whether these conventions were just taught to the artist, I don't know. I can't ask the artist because this is like 535 BC, has depicted the scene in the outlines of Sagittarius and Scorpio. And you can see that, I think, pretty clearly. Look at the bend in the knee of Sagittarius. Sagittarius has a very specific characteristics. All the constellations have characteristics which show up in the myths. Sagittarius looks like it's walking one way and looking back another way. You see how the goddess Artemis looks like she's walking one way and looking back another way? In the Bible, there's a woman named Lot's wife who's walking one way and she's told not to look back the other way, but she does. It's the same pattern in the story of Orpheus when he goes down to the underworld to rescue his wife Eurydice. He's told don't look back. Of course, after a while, he just has to look back. The same pattern is found in myths of Native American nations. It's found around the world. It's even found in Japan. But anyway, that characteristic of Sagittarius of walking one way, looking back the other way, informs many myths. And you can see in this outline the bend in the knee, the feet, the positions of the feet, the position of the bow. Look at how she's holding the bow. It's like at a kind of a low angle, just like the angle of Sagittarius. When, Orion holds a bow, Orion, the constellation, that's a different angle. It's like up at eye level. This is a Sagittarius figure. The ancient artist has even, look at that distinctive kind of plume coming up from the head of Sagittarius. And I've shown this on a lot of videos, so if you've seen it before, bear with me. But I think this is one of the most just unmistakable and beautiful pieces of artwork. Same bend in the knee, same angle of the bow, and then she's got like a tassel either on her scabbard or a quiver. I don't know what it is that the artist has put there on her shoulder, but it's quite clear she is a Sagittarius figure pointing her bow at basically a figure who is angled at the same angle as Scorpio, and even the dogs, their little tails could arguably make the curlicues of the tail of Scorpio, and also that's the southern crown right next to Sagittarius. I didn't put an arrow next to it, but it's right next to, underneath her bow, there's a little arc. That's called the southern crown, or corona australis. So here's one more. At the same museum, I found this. I'd never seen this painting before. It's on another Greek art. Look at Hercules. He's wrestling. He's wrestling with Triton, who can change shape. But look at, even when he's wrestling, he's got this exact same Hercules posture. He's got the deep knee bend. He's got the square head. He's in the same posture. And look at Triton has a crown on his head. There's the northern crown that we talked about. Just show you one more to show this is operating. It's operating in the Bible too. Now, I had a hard time with that when I first started to see the evidence. But since that time, I basically looked through the Bible, which I read the Bible a lot before I discovered any of these connections. When Hamlet's Mill would talk about connections to the Bible, I would say, oh, it's very nice to have connections to the Greek myths, but I'm not going to believe that Samson, for instance, is based on the stars. They talk about Samson being based on the stars. This is a picture not of Samson, but of There's got to be a giant there. It says David and Goliath. Yes, David and Goliath. And if you read the text, you'll see that he cuts off the head of Goliath with Goliath's own sword. That's why the sword is so big. This is a painting from the 1500s by an artist named Peter Paul Rubens, R-U-B-E-N-S, Peter Paul Rubens. These conventions, strangely enough, continue in sacred artwork in Europe, 1300s. All pictures of Bible scenes use the same celestial conventions. So somehow this system has been passed down and preserved all the way up to basically the 1800s. Then modern art, when Picasso and those painters came along, they basically threw away those conventions. But you look at Hercules and look at the outline of David and Goliath. Look at the constellation. Hercules is, David is clearly associated with Hercules in lots of different episodes. There's one episode where he's up on a roof and he sees Bathsheba. He goes out on the roof. Look at how Ophiuchus could look like a house with a roof. Anyway, in this case, he's fighting Goliath. Ophiuchus, in this case, is Goliath. Ophiuchus plays like Jotuns in the Norse myths, plays trolls, plays giants, plays a lot of giant figures because it's a pretty big constellation. Look at where David's stepping his foot, right on the temple of Goliath's head there. Just like Hercules, the constellation looks like it's stepping on Ophiuchus. And in this instance, David cuts off Goliath's head using Goliath's own sword. You can see the size of the sword in the constellation. So that I just put in one example from the Bible, but the same system is operating around the world. Actually, I forgot to mention, up right above the word Hercules, I just drew in, the whole constellation isn't, I cut it off a little bit, unfortunately, in this slideshow, but right above Hercules is this, right above Hercules. Look at the word Hercules and then look right above it, and I'll outline the constellation Lyra, the lyre, which is a musical instrument, not a person who lies, but a lyre, which is like a stringed instrument, right, that has strings. It's like a mini harp. Well, David, of course, plays a harp. He's the sweet singer of Israel who composes the Psalms. Why? Because the lyre, the little mini harp, is right next to him. Other figures in different myths play a lyre. So, oh, there it is, I put an arrow. So just to close out, I think that's enough to get you an idea of what I'm talking about. I could talk for hours, but I think that's enough to say I am convinced that the archaeological evidence that researchers like John Anthony West, Robert Schoch, Graham Hancock, and many, many others that point to something that our orthodox, our conventional history cannot explain, is reinforced by the myths that we find around the world, that they're all connected. There's some system, just like the pyramids in Egypt have similar proportions and ratios and processional numbers built into them as the pyramids in Mexico and other places in the world. Well, the myths around the world show clear evidence of being part of an ancient worldwide system. But like that mist painting, today we think they're all disconnected. And academics, if I try and show this evidence, it's just overwhelmingly clear. I could show you literally thousands of examples, but academics will not accept it because they want to see the mist painting as still divided up. Like, no, there's no way there's a connection between Egypt and the Maya. Or Norse myths, there's clear connections between the Norse myths and the Maya myths, or the myths of Japan. But they just want to see them as separate, when in fact they're all connected. But it's like those mist paintings, the connections have been forgotten over time. I don't know when it came from, but here's, Robert Schoch and John Anthony West got literally spit on and made fun of by the academics in the early 90s when they proposed that the Sphinx was much more ancient. And everyone said, well, where's your predecessor evidence? Where's your pottery? Blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, everybody knows about, this is obviously one of the pillars from Göbekli Tepe, which was buried deliberately buried not later than 8,000 BC. So who knows when it was made, but it had to have been made before that. How much more ancient is Göbekli Tepe than, the conventional people want to say the Sphinx was made in 2500 BC. Well, 2500 BC is 5,500 years later than Göbekli Tepe was buried. So Göbekli Tepe is more ancient. How long ago is this 2,500 years to us here in the year 2021? Well, 2,500 plus 2,000, 4,500. Göbekli Tepe is 5,500 years older than 2,500 BC. So this is more older, more ancient to the Egyptians than the ancient Egyptians are to us. So this system, I'm not saying the system came from Göbekli Tepe, although those are pretty celestial looking patterns. We've got a scorpion, we've got a bird wing. It's clearly some celestial looking patterns here. What I'm saying is there's obviously more ancient civilization or culture that is doing some interesting stuff. Whatever, I think that by the time ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia came around, this system was already, I think there was a catastrophe. And so all we have are the remnants of this system. Probably those ancient civilizations understood or preserved the system better than what we have today. But even they may not have fully understood how it all worked. But anyway, that is my last slide. I think we're living in this picture right here, a mist painting. There's a lot under the mist to be uncovered yet. And thank you for listening to that little presentation. That's what I have been researching.